Most of you are familiar with Waldo of Who's Waldo fame, right? Got a picture there? Waldo is the red and white striped shirt, stocking cap, and glasses wearing character usually found hiding in plain sight in a sea of other characters that comprise the drawings of British illustrator Martin Handford. Of course, now he's the star of books, video games, comic strips, TV shows, and such. But Waldo was first created back in 1986 at the request of Handford's art director, or the art director at Walker Books. The challenge for him was to create a character that would stand out and serve as a focal point in Handford's illustrations of crowds. The result was the lovable time-traveling character you see there, manifest in four-color glory amongst ordinary folks engaged in a variety of activities. Yesterday was the 12th day of Christmas, or Epiphany, the day Christians celebrate the very particular revelation of God in and through Jesus the Christ. The word epiphany comes from the Greek and means basically manifestation, especially manifestations of a divine nature. And the season of Epiphany, or the season after Epiphany, which we are now in, invites us to look for manifestations of Jesus or the Christ in our world, in our communities, and in our own lives. Today's passage tells the story of how Jesus' birth was made known or revealed or manifest to those three magi or kings who then followed the star of Bethlehem across the desert until they found the baby Jesus and paid homage to him, the one born King of the Jews. Now tradition tells us, this is not in the Bible, but tradition tells us that the three magi, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, represent the three continents of the known world at that time, Europe, Arabia, and Africa, and thus represented the revelation of Christ to the Gentile, the non-Jewish world. The gifts they brought were symbolic of the importance of Jesus' birth. The gold represented Jesus' royal standing, frankincense, his divine birth, and myrrh, his mortality. We often refer to these three travelers as the wise men because they were wise enough to recognize the sign they had been given by God, wise enough to seek out this Christ child, and wise enough to recognize the supreme importance of his birth. Now, in the Spanish-speaking world, the season of Epiphany, which lasts from yesterday through Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, in the beginning of Lent, is often celebrated by eating the king's bread, in which a plastic baby Jesus is hidden. Now, I learned something new in doing my research for this sermon. So whoever finds the baby Jesus in the king's bread is then responsible for taking it to church on February the 2nd to commemorate the presentation of the baby Jesus in the temple 40 days following his birth. Now, I have roots in Louisiana, and we've been eating king cakes for a long time, and I really never knew what that baby inside that king cake represented. There, it only meant that if you got the baby, if you were unlucky enough to get the baby, you had to host the next party, the Feast of Epiphany party, or buy the next king cake. But I digress. Both the season of Epiphany and this passage we read invite us to consider the continuing revelation of God in Christ in our world. Jesus, in a sense, has been hidden in plain sight since his birth. And I believe that more than 2,000 years later, he is still visible, even though his presence is often obscured by the noise around us and by the things of this world that distract us from knowing and seeing God. Far too often, I think, we get so caught up in living that we fail to recognize the presence of Christ in our midst. For me, this is a real Achilles heel. So one thing I want to do personally this year, one of the spiritual practices I want to adopt, involves being more open to and more aware of these epiphanies happening all around me, of these manifestations of the Christ that are still occurring. This, of course, will require some intentionality on my part, some discipline, which is not my strong suit. And to that end, there are two basic questions, two simple questions that my intention is to ask myself each day when I arise and each night before I go to sleep. One is, where do I see Jesus? Where do I see the Christ now? And then the second one growing out of that is, how do I show Jesus? How do I show the Christ to others? It's a kind of a where's Jesus exercise, if you will, and one that I've already begun. New Year's Eve, I had the opportunity to visit in the home of a longtime friend. Marcia and I met around 35 years ago when I was attending LSU. We were both active in the joint Presbyterian and United Methodist Campus Ministry, TUCM for short, the United Campus Ministry. I only stayed at LSU for a year before moving back to Texas, but Marcia and I remained friends. And then a few years later, she was in seminary at Duke in Raleigh-Durham when I was in seminary at Candler in Atlanta, and we continued that friendship, and we would visit back and forth during those 3 years we were in seminary. Then somehow over the years, as happens often, we lost touch. But thanks to the wonders of Facebook, we reconnected some years ago, and we renewed that friendship we'd started 35 years ago. At the time we reconnected, Marcia was living in Dallas and serving a Unitarian church there. Well, about four, maybe 5 years ago, Marcia's mom, Mary, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And once it became apparent to Marcia that her stepfather, Dan, was not able to really take care of her mother in the way that she was needing, Marcia basically packed up her life in Dallas, quit her job, and moved back home to Baton Rouge. Now, at first, she was able to work, and so she worked on getting her teacher certification and taught for a year in an elementary school there in Baton Rouge. But when she was not far into her second year, it became apparent that her mom's Alzheimer's was worsening, and so she had to quit that job and basically gave up any semblance of independence she still had. But that's what she wanted to do, to take care of her mom. As if this weren't challenging enough, about a year and a half ago, Marcia's family home, the one she'd grown up in, was one of the thousands in the Baton Rouge area that was flooded in that catastrophic monsoon-like rains that hit the region. And for over a year, Marcia and her mom and her stepdad were unable to live in their home. They tried at first to take Mary to Dallas to stay with one of Marcia's brothers, one of her sons, but it proved to be too disorienting for her. She really needed to be in a familiar surrounding. So the stepfather, Dan, bought a motorhome, parked it in the driveway, and the three of them lived in that for over a year as they gutted and rebuilt their house. I can't even imagine how stressful that must have been. When I visited them last Sunday, New Year's Eve, they were back in the mostly completed house, but Mary's Alzheimer's had progressed to a point that Marcia couldn't even leave her alone in her room for 5 minutes. She even had to have respite care come in if she were going to spend time working on completing the renovation, the restoring of the house. Well, Wednesday morning, we got home Tuesday night, and Wednesday morning I had a text from Marcia that her mom was in the hospital. She wasn't doing well when I was there. Apparently she had pneumonia and was dehydrated, and they admitted her Tuesday night. Friday morning, I awoke to a text that Mary, Marcia's mom, had passed away. And as I thought about Marcia and her mom and all the sacrifices Marcia made out of love for her mother, it occurred to me that in Marcia, I've seen the manifestation of Christ, a glimpse of God with skin on, God with us, still present and visible and working in our world. And I wondered about how many people would literally pack up their lives and put them on hold for several years in order to care for an ailing parent, assuming they could. But then I thought about some of you. And I thought about the sacrifices I know that many of you have made to either care for family members. Sometimes you even take in people you don't know. And I think about all the ways you reach out in the face of Christ to people in this community and in the surrounding communities, in the acts of compassion and love and mercy that you're involved in. And I think, yeah, there are people all around me that do this all the time. And in you, I see glimpses of God. I see the face of Christ still present in the midst of our ordinary, hectic lives. And to me, that's what Epiphany is about. It's about seeing that. God is still at work in our world. Christ is revealed all around us. If only we'll have ears to hear and eyes to see. If only we'll allow ourselves also to be vessels or agents of Christ's self-giving love in our world. Yesterday, Bishop Karen Oliveto of the Big Sky area of the Methodist Church shared these thoughts on Facebook, and I really liked them. She said the wise men had come from the east looking for Jesus. They had seen the star, and they knew that the King of the Jews had been born. This frightened Herod terribly, for he knew this king could threaten his own power. So he asked the wise men to let him know when they found Jesus, for he wanted to pay homage as well. At least that's what he told them. We who stand on the other side of history know that Herod wanted to destroy the one received as his enemy. The wise men followed the star and kept looking for this king. It is their commitment, she says, to this task that moves me so. They didn't stray and they weren't distracted from their search, even when it led them to an unlikely place and an unlikely baby. This defenseless baby was the one who Herod feared that the wise men worshipped. For in this baby, she concludes, all heaven broke loose as God became one of us. Who could have imagined this? So where is Jesus? Where is Jesus in our world? He's everywhere. He's as near as your neighbor and as far as the deepest recesses of the cosmos. He's holding the hurting. He's helping the hungry. He's comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. He's as near as the hands and eyes and heart with which we minister to others. Where's Jesus? Look around you. If you really look, you will see and you will experience the Christ. And that is what the season of Epiphany is all about. Thanks be to God. Amen.